Good afternoon to all. I hope you've been having a great Saturday. I know I have. There's nothing better on a hot day than a good cigar and a cold drink. And that's what I'm enjoying right now in Sacramento, California. As we continue on the fourth chapter of Dark Days in Ghana, as President Kwame Nkrumah continues to tell us of the subversive tactics that the opposition were using to take away the upcoming and exciting independence of Ghana, to try to do everything they could to be the ones that would inherit power from the leaving colonialist Britain. And he goes in to tell us what the opposition leader, Busia, attempted. And this is how he continues. Osajefo says Busia, who led the opposition delegation to London, actually appealed to the British government not to grant independence. He said the country was not ready for it. He said, "We still need you, the British, in the Gold Coast." I imagine he would say today that the Americans were needed. He found some support among sections of the British press, but there could be no denying that the conditions laid down by the Secretary of State that my motion for independence should be passed by a reasonable majority in the newly elected legislature had been satisfied, and at long last, a date for independence was fixed, the 6th of March, 1957. He continues to say, "The long struggle to achieve our political freedom was over, but in a sense, our task of building a really independent Ghana was only just beginning. Political independence was incomplete without economic independence, and as I said in the midnight pronouncement of independence in Accra on 6th March 1957, the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. My government, therefore, was pledged the twin tasks of achieving economic independence for Ghana and of participating in the wider African Revolution. The former implied the adoption of socialist policies, since in the African situation, genuine independence is incompatible with capitalism, while the latter involved us in actively supporting the liberation and unity movements in Africa. In both these tasks, my government immediately came up against opposition from the same quarters as before, that is, from reactionary bourgeois elements inside Ghana and from imperialist and neo-colonialist interests outside. As before, these forces had a common interest. Both wished to delay economic independence and to impede the progress of the African Revolution. The tactics they employed were suitably adjusted to the new situation. After 1957, having repeatedly rejected by the electorate, the opposition lost hope in gaining office by constitutional means and embarked on a campaign of obstructing the work of government without making any attempt to devise an alternative program. They asserted themselves outside the democratic framework. Their policies, always regional in concept, became purely destructive, subversive, and violent, as you'll see later on in the reading, by the way. Before independence, they had been prepared to sacrifice our national liberation in order to keep me and my colleagues out of government. Now they were ready to sabotage our newly born freedom and to hold up the African Revolution by allying themselves even more closely with imperialist and the insidious forces of colonialism and causing a breakdown in administration so they might get a chance to grasp the reins of office. They employed every stratagem, from demanding the virtual secession of Ashanti, the northern region of Togoland, from the sphere of central Ghanaian authority, to a press campaign of abuse and lies to discredit me and the government. When this failed, they resorted to violence, assassination plots, and eventually to the subversion of army and police officers. For a time, after 1957, we tolerated the excesses of the opposition, but when their action began to undermine the state and to jeopardize its independence, we took measures, like all governments do in times of national emergency, to ensure the security of the nation. For example, we brought in the Avoidance Discrimination Bill to deal with the control of political parties based on tribal and religious affiliations. Its effect was to cause the various opposition parties to join together into a single party, the United Party. Later, after 2.5 years of putting up with a vicious opposition press campaign, certain restrictions were placed on the press, and a fifth attempt on my life made preventative detention necessary. By then, assassination attempts had resulted in the death of 30 Ghanaians, men, women, and children, and the wounding of some 300 others. These are all facts, by the way, that can be corroborated. We could not allow a small minority of unprincipled men to continue to stir up disunity and confusion with the object of overthrowing the government, which had the support of the overwhelming majority of the people of Ghana. Support shown decisively in the general election before independence and in the 1954 referendum, which established the Convention People's Party as a national party of Ghana. Maximum unity and effort was vital if my government was successfully to carry out its mandate of reconstruction and development. A distinction must be made between the loss of freedom to subvert and the loss of freedom of expression. At no time has my government denied the right of Ghanaians to hold political meetings and to discuss the country's affairs with complete frankness. In the National Assembly, as the official reports show, debates were vigorous and unrestricted. Members did not hesitate to criticize and expose social wrongs and injustices. Visitors to Ghana from non-socialist countries often spoke to me of their surprise at hearing politics discussed freely and openly throughout the country, when they had been led to believe that the one-party system stifled political differences and made any kind of criticism impossible. There were wide differences of opinion within the party, and members were always encouraged to say what they thought on all aspects of the government's policy. It has been said by a Western observer that within the CPP there were as wide political differences and antagonisms as those existing in Britain. The point I wish to make is that under our system of democratic centralism, criticism comes from within and is constructive. The people of Ghana, when they established a one-party state in the 1964 constitutional referendum, were merely giving de jure recognition to an established fact. The two-party system has shown itself to be unsuitable in any African state. It has grown up in Britain to serve Pacific class interests. It was perhaps our fault that we did not realize this sooner and attempt earlier to build a type of one-party state most suited to our needs. The Sierra Leonean army had exactly the same social background and British training as that of Ghana, and yet carried out its coup d'etat to suppress the two-party system. Indeed, the excuse offered by the Sierra Leonean rebels was that their actions was forced on them by the failure of the two-party system. The first priority in Ghana at the time of independence was to make use of our pitifully small stock of professional and technical experts. Whatever their political views, they had to be utilized to the full in the interest of the newly emergent Ghana state. From the start, I had to bring not only into my cabinet, but had to appoint to important posts in the judiciary, the civil service, and the universities, individuals who had been active opponents of the party in colonial days. We could not afford to do without such few qualified African doctors, accountants, architects, engineers, university teachers, and professional people, generally as were available immediately after independence. A formula had to be found by which they could not only be employed in state service and in development generally, but brought within the party. This, in its turn, meant that the party itself could not, in these conditions, restrict itself to those who had understood and had practiced a socialist ideology. The calculated risk of admitting these persons to our organization was one we had to take. Nevertheless, these colonial trained professional classes, with certain notable exceptions, looked on independence as a strictly national concern. In many cases, all they were concerned with was taking the places of the former colonial occupiers of their jobs and making the same money as these did in the same social and economic pattern. Insofar as they were within the party, they were a source of weakness because they sabotaged attempts to prevent corruption, and in a number of cases, actually joined in it themselves. Yet, if they had been excluded from the party, they would have joined the so-called opposition, which had become almost, from the moment of independence, a purely conspiratorial organization. In the same way, I had to try to accommodate within the party the leaders of the traditional society, the chiefs. On reflection, though, even because I trusted too much, really, in the power of a reformed chieftaincy, I was not mistaken in attempting to use properly. Let me go back and say that again. I was not mistaken in attempting to use popularly chosen chiefs within the framework of the government. It was then essential to have the broadest possible grouping of interest at home if we were to be sufficiently unified to deal with the external issue, namely the political unification of the African continent. I could have dismissed many of the higher police officers about whose loyalty I had doubts. But whom can I have put in their place? So little education was done in colonial times that actual illiteracy was a major problem in the army and police. Were it not for the continued criminal conspiracy by the opposition, then I might have taken the risk of abolishing the special branch at an earlier stage. After all, it was not even a part of the old colonial setup. It had only been instituted to deal with me and the CPP in 1949. If I had done so, however, all security have had to be entrusted to the party, and while I did not use it as a major source of information as to what was taking place in the country, once again it would have been equally dangerous to have relied exclusively on it. I had to combat not only tribalism, but the African tradition that a man's first duty was to his family group, and that therefore despotism was the highest of all virtues. While I believe we had largely eliminated tribalism as an active force, its byproduct and those of the family system were still with us. I could not have chosen my government without some regard to tribal origin, and even within the party itself, there was at times a tendency to condemn or recommend some individual on the basis of his tribal or family origin. Dangerous and defective as the police investigation system was, it did at least provide me with a second opinion from individuals trained, at any rate in theory, to give objective judgments. Further, the necessarily broad nature of the party makes some of its wealthier members quite willing to use its machinery for private ends and to discredit police officers and civil service who were looking too closely into their affairs. Of tribal and family groups, there were even those within it who might be prepared to recommend for detention individuals who took the opposite side to themselves in the election of a chief or in the running of traditional affairs. The issues we faced at independence were so gigantic that within every sphere we had to take calculated risks. We could not, however, obvious were the limitations of many of the police, the civil service, and the judiciary, change them overnight. We had no Revolutionary War which would have produced and trained those who might take their place. The problems we faced in independence were similar to those which confront most states emerging from colonialism. A once dependent territory, if it is to survive in the modern world, must try to accomplish in a single generation what it has taken developed nations 300 years or more to achieve. There is a need for radical change in practically every department of national life. For example, after a people's revolution, it is essential that the top ranks of the armed forces, police and civil service, be filled by men who believe in the ideology of the revolution, and not by those whose loyalty remain with the old order. In most cases, the whole economy of the country has to be reorganized. agriculture diversified, industries started from scratch, harbors, roads, airports built, and crash programs of education inaugurated to cope with the sudden and increasing demand for skilled technicians and administrators. In this great undertaking, there could be no place for slackers or saboteurs. The one-party system of government is now the accepted pattern of government in a large part of independent Africa. But when we were evolving this form, it was relatively new, and it was loudly condemned by our enemies. As I told members of the National Assembly in my sessional address on 1st February 1966, a one-party system of government is an effective and safe instrument only when it operates in a socialist society. In other words, it must be a political expression of the will of the masses working for the ultimate good and welfare of the people as a whole. On the other hand, a one-party system of government in a neo-colonialist client state, subject to external pressures and control, can quickly develop into the most dangerous form of tyranny, despotism, and oppression. It can become, in the hands of a few privileged, rascally minded, and selfish-minded individuals in a neo-colonialist state, a weapon and tool for suppressing the legitimate aspirations of the people in the interest of foreign powers and their agents. I repeat, a one-party system can only function for the good of the people within the framework of a socialist state or in a developing state with socialist programs. The government governs through the people and not through class cleavages and interests. In other words, the basis of government is the will of the people. And I really want people to understand that and stop believing these lies they hear about socialism. Study it yourself. And by the way, they're not talking about Marxism either. So let me continue. The capitalist imperialist world is still explaining the tension in the world today in terms of a conflict between dictatorship and democracy. The first is equated with communism and tyranny, the latter with enlightenment and freedom. In this way, imperialists and neo-colonialists seek to conceal the true content of the struggle, which lies in the reaction between capitalism and socialism. We expected opposition in our development plans from the relics of the old opposition, from the Anglophile intellectual and professional elite, and of course, from the neo-colonialists who view the obvious signs of our approaching economic independence with growing alarm. What we did not perhaps anticipate sufficiently was the backsliding of some of our own party members. Men like I'm sorry, let me spell that. Gbedemah. And sorry, I cannot at this point sufficiently pronounce the word. I think it was Gbedemah and Adam Mayfo, who for reasons of personal ambition and because they only paid lip service to socialism, sought to destroy the party. He'll go into that later, by the way. Right from the foundation of the party, as everyone in Ghana knows, I have waged a ceaseless war against corruption. In the Dawn broadcast made on 8th April 1961, I stressed the need to eliminate it from our society. I said, I am aware that the evil of patronage finds a good deal of place in our society. I consider that it is entirely wrong for persons placed in positions of eminence or authority to use the influence of office in patronizing others, in many cases wrong persons, for immoral favors. I am seeing to it that this evil shall be uprooted, no matter whose ox is gored. The same thing goes for nepotism, which is, so to speak, a twin brother of the evil of patronage. It is most important to remember that the strength of the Convention People's Party derives from the masses of the people. The men and women include those whom I constantly refer to as the unknown warriors, dedicated men and women who serve the party loyally and selfishly without hoping for reward. It is therefore natural for the masses to feel some resentment when they see comrades whom they have put into power and have given the mandate to serve the country in their behalf begin to forget themselves and indulge in ostentatious living. High party officials, ministers and ministerial secretaries, chairmen of statutory boards and corporations must forever bear this in mind. Some of us very easily forget that we ourselves have risen from amongst the masses. My difficulty was to get the police to enforce the principles I laid down. It was only when I personally supervised the direction of criminal investigation against ministers and prominent party members that anything was done. For example, a former member of agriculture, F.Y. Astar, was involved with one Coup D'etat, a civil servant's accomplice who was convicted. Even this case would never have came before the courts if I had not personally set up a special body independent of the police to investigate it. It is significant that the judge who tried this particular case was the first of those to be dismissed by the NLC, even before they got rid of the Chief Justice, and after the coup, Asar and his confederates had their convictions annulled by the NLC-constituted appealed court. Sufficient time has now elapsed to show that the NLC never seriously wished to investigate corruption. Had they done so, it would have involved so many of their own members. It was a propaganda device directed against my own government, making use of the fact that there were a number of instances of corruption among ministers and party officials. Unlike in Asar's case, they had not been dealt with because the police themselves could not furnish the evidence. The attitude of the NLC is shown by the fact that when I had mentioned in a broadcast from the beginning that Hartley and Deku were involved in the diamond smuggling, had challenged the NLC to set up an inquiry into diamond racketeering in Ghana, the commission which they were thus forced to establish sat in secret, and no report by it was ever issued. This purely propaganda approach is even better illustrated in my own case. I am alleged to have stolen millions. In fact, I have no money outside of Ghana except for the sums which I have been paid to me after the coup as royalties on my books, and which are now paid into the London branch of the National Commercial Bank of Scotland. I never handled any money personally for any external or internal purposes, and this included my own salary. All drawing on both on governmental and my personal accounts was countersigned by civil servants who were responsible to the Auditor General for all public expenditure, and who, for my own purposes, regarded my own personal expenditure. It's kind of hot back here where I am now. Let me do this again. Forgive me. I never handled any money personally for any external or internal purposes, that this included my own salary. All drawing on both governmental and my personal accounts was countersigned by civil servants who were responsible to the Auditor General for all public expenditure, and who, for my own purposes, recorded my personal expenditures. Any one of these officials could have produced a full and valid statement of how every penny was dealt with by the President's office, and exactly how my own salary was spent by me personally. If this had been done, it would have been shown that I refused to accept, as a political gesture, any of the expense allowances allotted to the President by law. In the same way, if my will had been published in full, it would have shown that I left nothing even to my own family, but bequeathed everything I did possess to the party and the state. Before the so-called inquiry, none of these detailed accounts were produced. Yet, Coup D'etat was called to testify that I had in fact taken the money which he had been convicted of stealing. The failure of the routine police investigation of corruption made it necessary for me to deal with it either by setting up a special body, as I did in D'Etat's case, or by appointing official commissions of inquiry to expose publicly notable members of our society, even members of government. Shortly before the Army and Police action on 24th February 1966, the report of the Commission of Inquiry into Trade and Malpractices in Ghana was published. It was a bold attempt to examine and expose the activities of men and women who were sabotaging our economic development plans by indulging in various forms of trade malpractices. Some of our wealthiest and most prominent citizens were mentioned by name. There was an immediate demand that legal action should be taken against them, and this was under consideration when the military and police treachery took place. Obviously, this kind of exposure brought us new and powerful enemies. But these people, by acting in the way that they did, were all at the same time secret enemies of the people, and it was essential to bring them to the surface. I regard the event sparked off on 24th February 1966 as a cleansing process. All those who had for so long been working either openly or secretly against us came together and exposed themselves in their true colors for all to see. By their very actions, on 24th February and in the months of the NLC rule, they have clearly shown themselves to be traitors to their country and stooges of neocolonialism. They have displayed their reactionary nature, their complete disregard for the common man, and for the progress of the African Revolution. It is like when you boil a pot hard. All the bits and pieces of useless stuff come to the top and you're able to skim them off easily. It is necessary to realize that, in many ways, the so-called coup d'etat has not been a setback, but has been merely a symptom of how neocolonialism is breaking down. Almost all African countries come to independence without armed struggle. This meant that it was impossible, in practice, to reconstruct these new states upon a socialist basis immediately. I was well aware of the compromises which it was necessary to make and the dangers which this entailed, but Ghana's independence, on any condition, was the first essential in securing the freedom of Africa. Not to have seized independence when we had the chance of obtaining it, whatever the liability we inherited, would have been criminal. The circumstances under which the CPP was formed resulted in it being a compromise organization composed of some genuine revolutionaries, but containing many of those who are interested in independence only so as to better themselves and to take the place of the previous colonial traders and businessmen. This meant that I had to include in my government, which I formed, representatives of all tendencies in the party, including businessmen on the make, such as Emmanuel Nkrumah and William Helm. In the circumstances of the day, there was at least a reasonable chance that such people would act honestly and would assist to build the state on a new basis. The experiment which we tried in Ghana was essentially one of developing the country in cooperation with the world as a whole. Non-alignment meant exactly what it said. We were not hostile to the countries of the socialist world in the way in which the governments of the old colonial territories were. It should be remembered that while Britain pursued at home coexistence with the Soviet Union, this was never allowed to extend to British colonial territories. Books on socialism, which were published and circulated freely in Britain, were banned in the British colonial empire, and after Ghana became independent, it was assumed abroad that it would continue to follow the same restrictive ideological approach. When we behaved as did the British in their relations with the socialist countries, we were accused of being pro-Russian and introducing the most dangerous ideas into Africa. So here, again, you can see the contradictions is glaring all over the place. Let's continue. In fact, the fault was that from the very circumstances in which we found ourselves, we were unable to introduce more dangerous ideas or to get them more widely understood. What went wrong in Ghana was not that we attempted to have friendly relations with the countries of the socialist world, but that we maintained too friendly relations with the countries of the Western Bloc. Before the military revolt, the policy of Ghana was based upon an attempt to develop the country along what we were essentially socialist lines. This policy could have succeeded had the Western world been prepared to see the coming into existence of a genuinely independent African state. In fact, they were not prepared to do so, and we thus gave them innumerable hostages to fortune. The coup d'etat, on its surface, was a military revolt against myself and what I stood for. If it analyzed more deeply, however, it is a mark of the breakdown of the Western attempt to influence and control Africa. The Western countries, having failed to control democratically supported African governments, were forced into the final extremity of substituting regimes which depended upon no other mandate than the weapons which they had held in their hands. Such puppet governments cannot survive for long in either Ghana or elsewhere in Africa. They are, in the first place, based on internal contradictions. Why they are tolerated is that their initial popularity is due to a sort of sympathetic magic. The prosperity of the Western world at the moment depends upon exploiting less developed countries. Each year, the Western world pays less for its imports and each year charges more for its exports. Those who make our coup believe, however, or at least pretend to believe, that if they copy or claim to copy the outward image of the Western world, then in some miraculous way, they will secure the advantages which the Western world enjoys. The contrary is the case. The individuals who have made the counter-revolution from Saigon to Sierra Leone are dependent for their political existence upon Western support. The countries over which they temporarily obtained control and therefore exploited are all the more, let me say that again, I'm sorry. Forgive me, let me say that again. Going a little too fast here. The individuals who have made the counter-revolution from Saigon to Sierra Leone are dependent for their political existence upon Western support. The countries over which they temporarily obtain control are therefore exploited all the more viciously. By supporting the reactionary rebellions in Africa, the Western countries have dug graves for imperialism and neo-colonialism and have put before the African people the clear choice, which was unclear before. Either go forward with a thorough revolution or else to continue in a situation which, year by year, impoverishes and humiliates them further. Events in Ghana since the military rebellion illustrate this admirably. Those who seized power claimed they came forward to save the economy, restore prosperity, democracy, freedom of the press, and the like. Instead, in order to maintain themselves in office at all, they have had to impose harsher taxation, sell out state enterprises to foreign interests, murder democracy, curb the press, and forcibly to suppress any type of consultation with the people. Instead, therefore, of proving that capitalism and the Western way of life are the best, they demonstrate that it not only brings increasing misery to all those who attempt to reproduce it in Africa. They thus, by their example, produce a genuinely revolutionary situation which did not previously exist, and which was, through its absence, one of the main reasons for African disunity and for the poverty of the continent. So we'll stop right there for now. We'll continue again a little later with that. I'm going to go and cool down. We still have much to go in chapter 4, and it's going to get even more interesting as we move on. These are facts what the president himself understood through policies of his own government, his own administration. So it needs to be understood by anybody listening to my voice who doubt what I'm saying here. This came straight from his mouth. He was the president of the Republic of Ghana. And no one knew more than he about the party he headed for 15 years in Ghana. So I hope you have a good evening. Thank you for listening. Please, those who come to the channel, please give me a like. And as always, I welcome your comments. I'll see you next time. Thank you.